What happens when a cargo ship gets hit by a missile one day and both superpowers promise a peace deal the very next morning? That single contradiction is the entire story of the Strait of Hormuz right now. One day, an explosion near a vessel. The next day, talk of a breakthrough. And by the time we are done here, you are going to understand why almost nobody actually trusts either side's version of events. Because in this conflict, the truth is not what anyone says, it is what the ships actually do. Before we dive in, if you want to understand global conflicts without the noise, hit that subscribe button right now. We break down these stories layer by layer so you can see what is really happening. And if this video helps you make sense of one of the most confusing standoffs in the world, tap that like button. It is the fastest way to tell us to keep digging into stories like this one. Here is where we stand. On August 3rd, a cargo ship called the Minoan Pioneer was struck by an unknown projectile near the edge of the Strait of Hormuz. Nobody claimed responsibility. Nobody died. And within 48 hours, both American and Iranian officials were telling reporters that a deal to fully reopen that same waterway could be announced within days. A ship getting hit one day, a breakthrough being promised the next. That is not a coincidence. That is the pattern that has defined this entire crisis for months. Understanding why takes us back to where this all started. The story really begins in late February of this year. According to multiple news agencies, the United States and Israel carried out coordinated airstrikes on Iranian military targets, an operation that also resulted in the death of Iran's supreme leader. That single event did not just shake the region. It completely reset the balance of power in the Gulf overnight. Iran's Revolutionary Guard, the branch of its military that answers to almost no one outside its own chain of command, responded immediately. They moved to shut down the Strait of Hormuz entirely. Warnings went out over radio to every commercial ship in the area. No vessel was permitted to pass without Iranian approval. Within days, shipping companies around the world began suspending their routes through the strait altogether, and the shockwaves hit global energy markets almost instantly. To understand why that mattered so much, you need to understand what this stretch of water actually is. It sits between Iran and Oman, barely 34 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. Before this crisis began, close to a fifth of the entire world's oil and natural gas supply passed through it every single day. There is no real alternative route that can carry that much volume. None. When Iran shut the door on this waterway, oil prices spiked almost immediately, and the world found itself staring down a genuine energy crisis. The United States did not sit back and watch. On the same day the Supreme Leader was killed, American forces launched a sweeping air and naval campaign, striking Iranian command centers, missile sites, naval vessels, submarines, and air defense systems across the region. Weeks later, the U.S. Air Force, the Navy, and the Israeli Air Force began a sustained campaign specifically aimed at forcing the strait back open, targeting the ships and drones Iran was using to enforce the blockade. Around the same time, the Iranian naval officer overseeing the entire closure operation was assassinated. That was not a symbolic move. It was a direct attempt to break the chain of command holding the blockade together. By the middle of spring, with earlier diplomatic talks having gone nowhere, the United States escalated again, this time imposing a full naval blockade on Iran itself, targeting ships entering and leaving Iranian ports. According to figures later released by U.S. Central Command, hundreds of vessels were intercepted. Several were seized outright. And Iran was losing hundreds of millions of dollars a day in trade. Iran responded by seizing cargo ships of its own, and for a while it looked like both sides were locked into a slow, grinding trade war fought entirely on the water. Then came a moment that looked for a brief window like the beginning of the end. American forces began publicly clearing sea mines from the strait, describing it as a gesture meant to benefit shipping nations around the world. On the very same day, American and Iranian negotiators sat down for their highest level talks in more than a decade. For a moment, it genuinely felt like the war might be winding down, but peace never quite arrived. A short ceasefire agreement was reached in the middle of June, and for a few weeks, there was real hope that this 5-month-long standoff might finally end through diplomacy instead of missiles. That hope collapsed within weeks. It fell apart over a dispute about which exact shipping routes vessels would be required to use through the strait. Fighting reignited in July. Iran fired on commercial vessels in nearby territorial waters, and the American military responded with what it called punishment strikes. The blockade, which had briefly eased, was reinstated in full, and in a sign of just how far this conflict had already spread beyond its original two sides, Yemen's Iran-backed Houthi movement declared its own separate blockade against Saudi Arabian ports, opening a second front in the Red Sea, while the Strait of Hormuz standoff was still nowhere near resolved. That brings us to exactly where things stand today in the first week of August. And this is where the picture gets genuinely complicated, because two very different stories are being told at the same time by two sides who both have reasons to shade the truth in their own favor. If you're finding this breakdown valuable, do not keep it to yourself. Share this video with one person who keeps asking you what is actually going on in the EU. Middle East. One tap could help someone finally understand this tangled situation. And while you are at it, drop a like to help more people find this analysis. Before we go further into this week's developments, it is worth pausing on what this conflict has actually cost the people caught in the middle of it. Because it is easy to talk about blockades and mine clearing in the abstract, and forget what happened on the water itself. Based on ongoing tracking of the crisis, at least 17 merchant ships have been damaged since the closure began, with several abandoned entirely by their crews. 2 ships were captured outright. A dozen seafarers have been killed or gone missing. A tugboat was sunk in Bahrain. A port worker lost his life, and 2 others were wounded in an incident connected to the wider crisis. These are not just statistics on a slide. These are real people who had nothing to do with the politics driving this conflict. They were simply trying to cross for work. It is also worth remembering that this is not the first time the Strait of Hormuz has become a flashpoint. Iran has threatened to close it during moments of tension going back decades, including during tanker attacks in the late 1980s, and again, during periods of heightened conflict more recently. What makes this year different is that for the first time in the modern era, Iran actually followed through on a full closure instead of just threatening one. And for the first time, the United States responded with a sustained blockade of Iranian ports in return, rather than limited retaliatory strikes. That distinction matters more than it might sound. Threats are cheap, governments make them constantly. And over the decades, the world has learned to treat Iran's warnings about Hormuz almost like background noise. A familiar bluff repeated every time tensions rise. This time was different precisely because Iran followed through, because the United States chose to match that follow-through with its own sustained pressure, rather than a few symbolic strikes and a return to the status quo. That is what turned a regional dispute into a genuine global energy story. Now, let us get to where things stand this week, because this is where the contradiction we opened with really comes into focus. On one hand, U.S. Central Command says the Strait of Hormuz is, in its own words, free and open. It reported that it had assisted more than 1,000 vessel transits through the strait over the previous 3 months. That is not a small number, and if accurate, it suggests real commercial traffic has continued despite everything happening around it. On the other hand, independent tracking organizations tell a far more complicated story. According to one shipping monitoring group, U.S. forces had, as of early August, redirected 45 commercial vessels, attempting to pass through what it describes as an ongoing blockade, disabled 2 ships that refused to comply, and boarded 2 more to enforce compliance. The same group reported that open transits through the southern route of the strait declined sharply after Iranian forces struck commercial shipping in early July, and that traffic since then has been dominated by vessels linked to Iran, and China moving through a separate northern corridor. Since the ceasefire collapsed in June, trackers say they have recorded dozens of tankers leaving the Gulf loaded with Iranian oil and petrochemicals, representing tens of millions of barrels and generating billions of dollars in revenue. Revenue that, according to these organizations, continues to fund Iran's missile and drone programs. So which version is true? A strait that Central Command calls free and open, or a strait that independent trackers say is still being actively contested? Based on everything available, the honest answer is that both things are true at the same time, just in different ways. Traffic is moving, ships are getting through, but it is happening under armed escort, under redirection, under the constant threat of attack, and largely through a split system where Iranian and Chinese-linked vessels use one route and everyone else uses another. That is not what most people picture when they hear the words free and open. At best, it is open under duress, which brings us to the diplomatic track, because this is where the most significant movement has actually happened this week, not on the water, but at the negotiating table. According to reporting from multiple news agencies, Iran said earlier this week that it was in the final stage of drafting an agreement with Oman, specifically covering the Strait of Hormuz. American officials said publicly that an announcement could come within days. The emerging framework reportedly involves a 60-day arrangement, extendable by agreement, in which inbound traffic would route through a northern lane inside Iranian waters, and outbound traffic would use a southern lane through Omani waters coordinated with Iran. Under the proposed terms, no tolls would be charged during the initial period, and both sides would work to clear naval mines from the middle of the strait within 30 days. But here's the significant catch. Iran's own deputy foreign minister told reporters this week that even if this agreement is finalized, it would not automatically reopen the strait. Iran's foreign ministry spokesperson has been direct about this in multiple statements, saying an agreement with Oman on shipping routes has nothing to do with whether the strait as a whole reopens, and that the real source of ongoing instability in Iran's view is the American naval blockade and other measures Iran considers hostile. In other words, Iran appears to be negotiating a narrow technical arrangement on shipping lanes, while simultaneously insisting that the larger closure remains. A separate unresolved issue tied to the U.S. blockade being lifted. And there is another detail buried in this story that deserves real attention because it is the kind of thing that gets lost in more sensational headlines. According to a source close to the talks, the Iranian delegation involved in these negotiations does not include representation from the Revolutionary Guard, the very organization that would actually have to sign off on the operational details of any agreement, and the same organization that has enforced the closure and carried out strikes on shipping throughout this entire conflict. If that is accurate, it means the people sitting at the table may not be the people with the actual power to make any deal real. That is not a small detail. It might be the single biggest reason to treat this week's optimistic headlines with real caution. Oman, Qatar, and Pakistan have all played facilitating roles in these talks, working to keep engagement between Iran and the United States moving forward, though officials from all three have been careful to note that no final agreement has actually been reached. On the American side, the messaging has been consistently optimistic, but consistently vague on exact timing, with one senior official suggesting a deal could come as early as today or tomorrow, a phrase that has now been used more than once without an actual deal materializing. Other officials have stressed that real progress has been made, while also admitting that no final agreement is signed yet. One senior American official struck a noticeably more cautious tone, telling an interviewer that negotiations with Iran could take time because Tehran, in his words, has a fractured system, a clear reference to the gap between Iran's diplomatic negotiators and its military leadership. You have made it this far, which tells me you actually care about understanding the full picture. That is exactly why we create these breakdowns. Hit that like button right now to support this kind of detailed analysis, and subscribe so you never miss an update. Every week we break down a new critical development. Be part of this community. There is also a financial detail worth flagging because it works against the idea of a clean imminent resolution. The proposed framework reportedly involves service fees charged to vessels for security and environmental protection during transit. The United States has said it strongly opposes any arrangement that would let Iran charge fees on ships passing through the strait, viewing it as a toll that would effectively cement Iranian control over an international waterway. Maritime industry groups have separately warned that any such fees could raise costs for shipping companies and eventually for everyday consumers, regardless of who actually collects the money. Now, layer on top of all this a story about American military readiness that has been generating its own headlines this week because it is directly relevant to how much real leverage the United States actually has in these negotiations. Reports citing sources familiar with the matter suggest that a large share of interceptors for a key American missile defense system have been depleted after months of sustained conflict, and that overall munition stockpiles are, in the words of one source, dangerously low. American officials have pushed back hard on this reporting, insisting the United States has massive amounts of munitions and expressing full confidence in current military leadership. What is different now is the direct timing between the Houthi blockade of Saudi ports and the broader Iran-US conflict playing out simultaneously in the Strait of Hormuz. Shipping analysts have pointed out that this effectively puts pressure on two of the world's most important maritime choke points at the exact same time. The Strait of Hormuz on one side of the Arabian Peninsula and the Red Sea corridor on the other. Some shipping companies have responded by rerouting vessels entirely around the southern tip of Africa, adding significant time and fuel costs to voyages between Asia and Europe rather than risk either choke point. That rerouting, more than any single strike or seizure, is one of the clearest signs of how seriously the shipping industry is actually treating this risk, no matter what officials on either side say publicly about the current safety of transit. There is also the economic backdrop sitting underneath all of this, easy to lose track of amid the back and forth diplomatic headlines, but it explains why so much attention keeps circling back to this one narrow stretch of water. The international benchmark for oil pricing rose nearly 4% this week alone, driven specifically by uncertainty over whether the Oman deal would actually materialize. Officials have acknowledged that oil prices remain elevated compared to levels before this crisis began, even while expressing confidence that prices will eventually come down as the situation stabilizes. Before this conflict started, the Strait of Hormuz carried roughly a fifth of the entire world's oil supply and a similar share of global natural gas shipments. Every single day, the traffic through the strait remains constrained, redirected, or conducted under armed escort rather than under normal commercial conditions. That pressure on global energy markets does not go away. It just keeps building quietly in the background. It is also worth noting how the mine clearing effort itself has evolved since it was first announced. According to reporting on the operation, additional forces, including underwater drones, were expected to join the clearing effort in the days following its launch, and the military indicated it planned to share a confirmed safe pathway with the shipping industry once that work was further along. That detail matters because it shows the mine clearing operation was never framed even by the U.S. military itself as an instant fix. It was described from the very beginning as a phased process, one that would take real time to complete and verify. That is part of why months later the question of when the strait is genuinely safe for normal commercial transit is still being negotiated rather than simply announced. It is worth stepping back for a moment here and asking what a realistic best case and worst case actually look like from where we stand right now, based only on what has been reported, not on speculation. In the best case, the Oman-brokered shipping lane agreement gets finalized in the coming days, exactly as several officials have suggested is possible. Mine clearing continues along the middle of the strait. The Revolutionary Guard, despite not being directly at the table, ultimately falls in line with whatever agreement Iran's civilian negotiators reach, and traffic through the strait genuinely normalizes for the first time since February. That outcome would ease pressure on global oil markets and could open the door to the separate, much harder negotiation over Iran's nuclear program that officials have described as the real larger deal still waiting to be had. In the more cautious scenario, this appears to be the one several sources close to these talks are quietly preparing for. A narrow technical agreement on shipping lanes gets signed, but Iran continues to insist, exactly as its own foreign ministry spokesperson already has, that this deal does not equal a genuine reopening of the strait. The Revolutionary Guard, absent from the negotiating table, either slow walks implementation or continues sporadic attacks like the one on the Minoan Pioneer, quietly undermining confidence in the corridor even after an agreement gets announced. The American blockade on Iranian ports stays in place, something Iran has repeatedly cited as its own justification for continued instability, and the wider regional conflict through the Houthis and allied militias keeps expanding in parallel regardless of what specifically happens inside the Strait of Hormuz itself. There is one more thread worth pulling on here because it explains why so many officials keep drawing such a hard line between the shipping lane talks and everything else surrounding this conflict. The distinction officials keep making between what they call the strait negotiation and the much bigger, far more difficult deal over Iran's nuclear ambitions is not just diplomatic phrasing. It reflects a real structural choice both sides appear to be making right now. By treating the shipping lane question as a narrower, more technical issue involving only Iran and Oman, the two countries whose waters actually border the strait, negotiators may be trying to create a limited achievable win that does not require either side to resolve the much harder underlying questions. Iran's nuclear program, the future of the American blockade, and whether Iran keeps any long-term leverage over a waterway, it does not legally control outright. That is likely why Iranian officials keep repeating again and again that a shipping lane agreement with Oman does not equal reopening the strait. They may be trying to bank a narrow diplomatic win on shipping routes while keeping every other point of leverage in reserve for the far tougher negotiations still ahead. That tougher negotiation hangs over everything described in this video. Iran's foreign ministry has said that broader peace talks could resume once an agreement on the strait is reached. But reaching that point depends entirely on this narrower shipping deal actually holding up first. And that circles right back to the core problem sitting underneath this entire crisis. If the organization enforcing the closure for the past 5 months is not even part of the agreement meant to end it, the durability of any deal remains genuinely uncertain, no matter how confidently officials in Washington, Muscat, or Tehran describe the progress being made this week. Before we wrap this up, it is worth being upfront about where all of this information comes from and where the honest uncertainty actually lies. The timeline in this video draws on reporting and statements from multiple military sources, wire services, and independent vessel tracking organizations. Statements attributed to Iranian officials come from Iran's own state news agency, as reported by international outlets. And it is worth being clear that Iranian state media has an obvious interest in shaping how this conflict gets perceived, just as American officials have their own interest in projecting strength during active negotiations. Where the two sides give conflicting accounts, whether the strait is currently free and open, or whether it remains under contested redirected traffic, this video has tried to present both claims honestly, rather than simply picking one side as fact. The single biggest open question, based on everything gathered here, is whether an agreement negotiated without direct involvement from the Revolutionary Guard can actually hold once it is signed. Nobody consulted for this story claims to know that answer yet. That uncertainty is not a weakness in this reporting. It is simply the honest shape of the situation right now. So here is the honest state of play as of this week. The Strait of Hormuz has not been cleanly reopened, and it has not been definitively kept closed either. It exists right now in a strange in-between state. technically passable, heavily contested, diplomatically close to a breakthrough, and still as recently as a few days ago, dangerous enough that a cargo ship got hit by an unidentified projectile within sight of the shoreline. Whatever gets announced in the coming days, whether it is a genuine reopening or another fragile arrangement that quietly falls apart the way the last one did within weeks, the underlying tension driving this entire conflict, a fight over who actually controls one of the most important waterways on Earth, is not going away just because a document gets signed in Muscat or Tehran. One last thing worth leaving you with. The price of oil itself has become a kind of real-time referendum on how credible all of this diplomacy actually is. Every time an optimistic statement comes out of Washington or Tehran, markets react. Every time a vessel gets hit or a Houthi attack widens the conflict, or a source tells a reporter that American forces are running low on interceptors, that reaction shifts right back the other way. Oil climbing nearly 4% on uncertainty alone, even while officials kept insisting a deal was close, tells you something important. Traders who have no particular loyalty to either side's talking points are not yet convinced this is actually resolved. That might be the most honest signal available right now, more honest than any single government's press statement, because it reflects real money being placed on a real outcome, not words chosen carefully for a camera. Here is what I will leave you with. Does this shipping lane framework actually hold, or does it quietly collapse the same way the last one did within weeks? Drop your prediction in the comments right now, because a few months from now, we are going to come back to this exact video and see who called it correctly. And if you want to be here when we do, make sure you are subscribed, because this story is far from finished. The next update might be the one that finally tells us which version of this conflict was true all along.